the most brutal prison gangs in the United States. The story begins long before dawn inside California's Pelican Bay State Prison, a place built to contain the most dangerous inmates in the country. Surrounded by mist from the northern coast and locked inside a concrete fortress, the prison feels more like an abandoned military bunker than a correctional facility. But on the morning of August 27, 2005, investigators realized something that shook the entire system. A threat was rising from deep inside its most secured unit. A correctional officer had discovered a sheet of paper hidden beneath a metal bunk inside the security housing unit, a wing designed for inmates who could not mix with any others. That sheet, barely larger than a grocery list, held something investigators whispered about for years afterward. It contained handwritten nicknames, inmate numbers, and coded notes. At first glance, it looked harmless. But to the officers who knew the signs, it meant something else. A hit list. This discovery wasn't just a prison note. It became the centerpiece of one of the most important investigations in modern corrections history. And it all pointed back to one group, the Aryan Brotherhood, a prison gang that federal agencies described as small in number, but incredibly organized. What shocked investigators wasn't just that a list existed, but that it came from men who were supposed to be completely isolated from one another. In Pelican Bay, high-risk inmates in the SHU lived in solid concrete cells and were kept under strict supervision. Communication was believed to be nearly impossible. But investigators were about to learn how wrong that assumption was. When the note was analyzed, experts realized it wasn't just random names. It was part of a larger puzzle, a system of secret communication that spanned multiple prisons across the state. Inmates in solitary confinement had managed to pass messages by using legal mail, coded letters, and even tiny pieces of paper carried out in clothing or food trays. Every message carried instructions, warnings, or updates on gang activity happening hundreds of miles away. The deeper the investigation went, the clearer the picture became. Leadership figures within the Aryan Brotherhood were coordinating criminal activity without ever leaving their cells. Federal agents uncovered communication trails that stretched from California to federal facilities in the Midwest, revealing discussions involving drug smuggling routes, extortion targets, and gang disputes. All of it planned from inside one of America's most secure prisons. But Pelican Bay wasn't an isolated case. While investigators were chasing the coded messages in California, another discovery had been brewing hundreds of miles away in Texas. In 2001, federal authorities launched a major investigation into the Mexican Mafia, one of the most structured and influential prison-based groups in the United States. As agents traced contraband and intercepted letters, they found something startlingly similar. Inmates were directing assaults and intimidation efforts inside prisons using handwritten notes called kites. Some notes were smuggled inside food trays. Others were hidden in folded clothing or passed through corrupt contacts. One of the most alarming findings was that some orders didn't stop at prison walls. Investigators discovered situations where individuals outside the system were being pressured or coerced based on instructions coming from inside. These revelations prompted one of the largest crackdowns in the history of the Texas prison system, and the cases ultimately led to dozens of indictments and long-term surveillance efforts. Across the country in Illinois, yet another investigation was revealing just how deeply prison organizations could influence inmate behavior. At the Stateville Correctional Center, authorities uncovered a different structure entirely. The Gangster Disciples, a group with roots in Chicago street organization, had developed a detailed internal hierarchy within the prison. Investigators found leadership roles, written rules, and coordinated directives that governed how members interacted, who handled contraband, and how disputes were resolved. One name was impossible to ignore: Larry Hoover, a man whose influence extended far beyond his cell. Court records and investigative documents described a system that resembled a corporation more than a typical gang operation. Inside Stateville, Hoover's communications, often sent through visitors, phone calls, or coded messages, contributed to unrest that later escalated into violent conflict between groups, forcing prison officials to overhaul security protocols. By the mid-2000s, these separate investigations, Pelican Bay, Texas, Chicago, all pointed toward the same unsettling truth: many of the most impactful criminal operations inside U.S. prisons weren't happening in the open yard. They were happening behind steel doors and thick concrete walls. Even inmates in solitary confinement, kept under tight restrictions, had found ways to influence events hundreds of miles away. Investigators who worked the cases described the same feeling, a realization that for decades, the prison system had underestimated the adaptability of highly organized groups. These discoveries forced agencies to rethink how they monitored communication, managed high-risk individuals, and coordinated federal intelligence. But the biggest shock was still to come. During the Pelican Bay investigation, agents uncovered something hidden deeper than coded notes, a message buried inside a legal envelope that hinted at a coordinator, someone working quietly behind the scenes to move information between prisons. Someone who, according to one handwritten clue, knew every message before it left the cell. When federal officers traced the source of that cryptic line, they found a name and a position no one expected: a prison staff member. And that was the moment everything changed. The discovery stunned investigators. For months, federal agents had been tracing the flow of coded messages across California's prison network. They expected to find inmates acting as couriers, or outside associates delivering information through visits or mail. But nothing prepared them for what the handwriting analysis, mail logs, and internal interviews revealed. Someone working inside Pelican Bay had quietly enabled the communication system to evolve far beyond what any inmate alone could manage. The person in question worked in a position that rarely drew attention, far from the tension of the yards and away from the routine movement of inmates. Staff described the individual as quiet, efficient, and always on schedule. But when investigators reviewed mail handling patterns and cross-checked envelopes that had moved through the facility, they noticed something unusual. Certain batches, always processed during one specific shift, were bypassing the standard cross-inspection procedures. Nothing dramatic, just enough irregularities to raise questions when combined with other evidence from the Aryan Brotherhood investigation. To move forward carefully, federal officers requested a discreet internal audit. It began with something simple: tracking which staff members had access to sealed legal correspondence and who handled it on days when suspicious messages were found. The deeper they looked, the more a pattern appeared. The staff member in question had unknowingly flagged themselves by being consistently connected to mail that turned up in unrelated investigations at other facilities. The next step was interviewing inmates with no known gang ties, people who had reason to report misconduct without fear of retaliation. What they said wasn't direct proof, but it added a critical piece to the puzzle. Some mentioned that certain envelopes always arrived or departed faster when that particular staff member was working. Others recalled overhearing conversations among inmates hinting that someone in the building owed favors or helped things move. Not specific, not accusatory, just hints. But in an investigation like this, small hints mattered. At the same time, in Texas, federal agents investigating the Mexican mafia uncovered unusually detailed correspondence outlining inmate movements and schedule changes, information that typically required someone with inside access to accurately compile. Nothing connected the Texas case directly to Pelican Bay, but investigators recognized a parallel. Organized prison groups had become skilled at identifying weak points in the system, finding individuals who could be influenced, manipulated, or misled into helping without realizing the consequences. The Stateville investigation added another layer. Files revealed examples where staff had unknowingly passed messages simply by following routine procedures that allowed certain papers to move between units without deeper inspection. There was no universal method used by all groups, but the theme remained consistent. Structure and organization allowed these networks to expand beyond what most correctional agencies initially imagined. Back in California, the Pelican Bay case reached its turning point when a routine facilities report surfaced related to a misplaced envelope. It had been logged incorrectly, then found hours later in an unexpected location, clearly handled by someone familiar with mail flow inside the prison. The envelope contained no criminal instructions. Instead, it held names, dates, and what appeared to be updates between incarcerated gang members located in separate facilities. This time, investigators reacted quickly. Surveillance procedures were quietly adjusted. A new chain of custody system was implemented specifically for legal mail. Without warning, access points were limited and oversight increased. And right at that moment, within days, communications between suspected prison gang leaders slowed almost to a halt. The timing was enough to confirm investigators' suspicions. Someone inside had been enabling the information flow, even if unintentionally. But uncovering how deep their involvement went required patience. Internal interviews expanded. Federal partners reviewed older correspondence logs with a finer lens. And as they worked, the broader picture of prison-based gang communication in the United States came into focus. The Aryan Brotherhood, the Mexican Mafia, and the gangster disciples had very different histories, leadership structures, and internal cultures. But they all had one thing in common: the ability to adapt, even under the strictest confinement conditions. Investigators determined that communication systems were built not on dramatic acts or elaborate escapes, but on subtle, persistent patterns, coded phrases hidden inside legal documents, messages relayed through third parties who believed they were helping with harmless requests, and the exploitation of small procedural gaps inside large institutions. One veteran officer later described it this way: "They don't need loud moments. They use quiet ones." The Pelican Bay investigation kept uncovering those quiet moments. Agents found letters whose meanings only became clear when compared across years of correspondence. They identified patterns where multiple inmates used the same unusual phrasing, evidence of shared instruction. They found repeated references to dates and numbers that matched shifts, mail collection times, or scheduled transfers. And then came the most significant discovery: a communication pathway that connected Pelican Bay to another high-security facility several states away. Not through contraband phones or illicit devices, but through everyday paperwork, mundane, routine forms processed by staff who never imagined they were part of a larger network. The inside staff member who first raised suspicion was placed under careful review. Investigators found no evidence of intentional wrongdoing, no financial gain, no active collaboration, no knowledge of the broader network. Instead, the findings suggested subtle manipulation, situations where an inmate might request a favor, a harmless exception, or a minor convenience. Over time, those small favors unknowingly helped sensitive correspondence move through the system. The revelation created a ripple inside Pelican Bay. Leadership quietly restructured mail protocols, adjusted staff rotations, and introduced new layers of verification. What emerged from this investigation wasn't just one compromised access point. It was a deeper understanding of how organized groups coordinated under the radar. But as federal agencies compared findings across states, one question became impossible to ignore. If these communication networks existed in multiple highly secure facilities, what else might be happening beyond view? The answers surfaced unexpectedly during a search of archived correspondence from years earlier. A single coded message hinted at something far more organized than anyone assumed. Something that didn't just belong to one prison system, or one gang, or one state. A multi-state network. Its existence would reshape how investigators understood prison gang operations across the country. The clue was easy to miss. Just a few lines of coded text found in an old stack of archived mail from nearly a decade earlier. It had been overlooked during the original investigation because it didn't match the immediate focus at the time. But now, with fresh eyes and the context of multiple statewide investigations, its meaning was impossible to ignore. The message referenced 3 prisons in 3 different states, each represented only by numbers, visitation blocks, inmate housing units, transfer dates. None of it seemed unusual until investigators compared the timestamps. All 3 messages had been sent within the same week, by inmates who had never met, never lived in the same facility, and belonged to different groups. This wasn't coincidence. It was coordination. Federal analysts worked for months tracing old letters, comparing writing styles, and digitally cataloging the subtle patterns that had gone unnoticed for years. What they found was unsettling, a communication lattice that stretched far beyond Pelican Bay, Texas, or Stateville. Dozens of letters, harmless when viewed individually, held shared structures and recurring symbols that connected them like pieces of a map. And that realization opened a new line of questioning. How many individuals across the country had unknowingly played a small part in this larger network? To answer it, investigators expanded the search nationwide. They interviewed retired officers, reviewed archived mailroom logs, and revisited cases involving contraband that had been loosely connected to prison gangs but never linked to a broader scheme. Slowly, patterns emerged, indicating that major prison-based groups had developed a long-standing method to share information without attracting attention. It wasn't a single system. It wasn't controlled by one gang. It wasn't even centrally organized. It was adaptive, flexible, built to survive. In California, the Aryan Brotherhood's communication relied heavily on coded legal mail, simple, consistent, and designed to blend into everyday processes. In Texas, the Mexican Mafia leaned on short handwritten notes, often smuggled or disguised in ways that passed as routine. In Illinois, the gangster disciples used structured terminology within permitted communication channels, creating a set of internal signals that meant little to the untrained eye but carried weight among members. Different strategies. Same outcome. Federal agencies realized the system had developed organically over decades, shaped by thousands of small decisions, adjustments, and opportunities taken by people inside prisons who understood how to navigate the rules. One investigator described it as a river made of smaller streams, each group operating independently, but all benefiting from the same blind spots in the correctional system. When this became clear, federal agencies began coordinating their efforts more closely than ever before. Information that once stayed within state jurisdictions now flowed between departments. Analysts from different regions compared code sheets, transfer records, and court files. Digital tools were used to identify repeated language patterns across thousands of documents. And then came the breakthrough. A federal team noticed that a series of coded phrases found in Pelican Bay letters matched fragments of correspondence discovered in Oklahoma, Florida, and parts of the Midwest. These letters weren't linked to the same gang. They weren't related to the same case. But they all involved inmates in high-security housing. The shared structure suggested that over many years, incarcerated individuals had passed down communication techniques, methods that spread from one prison to another through transfers, shared legal resources, or even informal conversations during yard time in lower security facilities before individuals were moved to restricted units. Wait until you see what happens when the next one starts. Hit subscribe, because this story is just getting started.